You are on an ordinary trip, the sun is shining, the road is smooth, everything seems normal, but suddenly directions fail, the landscape changes, and the familiar transforms into something disturbing. You realize you've entered a place where time doesn't follow the rules and exit seems impossible. This is the nightmare that awaits John. A road that leads nowhere, and a city that doesn't want to let him go. John, a 35-year-old businessman, was on a business trip. He was heading to a nearby town when his GPS began to fail. The roads, once familiar, now looked different. The dense forest around him became oppressive, and the weathered road signs no longer pointed the right way. John felt a slight unease as he drove along the deserted road. The once pleasant scenery seemed to transform into something strange and isolated. As he drove, his discomfort only grew. The car radio, which had previously played familiar songs, now emitted only static, as if it had lost its connection to the real world. The silence around him became unsettling, and the trees on the side of the road leaned forward as if they were watching his every move. The vegetation seemed to close in tighter and tighter, creating a dense barrier that muffled even the sound of his own thoughts. The isolation of that place was palpable. The signs, corroded and faded, no longer made sense. None of them pointed in which direction he should go, as if they had been abandoned there for years. With every mile, the landscape became more mysterious. It was as if John was going beyond a simple mistake. He was entering a territory where time and space followed different rules. The winding road, which had once been just a detour, now felt like a trap, as if it were taking him somewhere he shouldn't be. The sky, which was beginning to darken, added a new layer of tension. The sun was disappearing behind the hills, and the few remaining lights would soon be replaced by deep shadows. John glanced nervously at the clock on the dashboard, feeling the time passing, but not knowing exactly how much longer he had to reach his destination. The further he went, the more he realized that he might be moving away from any familiar place. The deserted road, once a simple escape route, now seemed endless, as if it led nowhere. John's tension grew as he tried to follow his instincts in the few directions his GPS still gave him. The trees grew taller, the road narrower. He believed that he would soon find a main highway again, but everything seemed wrong. It was then that he saw a small town in the distance, a town that did not appear on his maps. With no other options, he decided to stop and ask for directions, certain that he would find a solution. John parked his car in front of an old gas station. The place looked like it had come from another time. There was no one there. The houses were simple, with closed curtains, and the whole town seemed to be stuck in time. The only sound was the wind blowing, raising dust in the empty streets. He decided to cross the street and enter a small market, which seemed to be the only active establishment in this silent place. Inside the market, John found a woman behind the counter, her face weathered and her gaze fixed. There was none of the usual welcoming smile he had expected to find in such a small place. Instead, the woman seemed to be watching him with a mixture of suspicion and discomfort, as if his presence were an unexpected disturbance. Her eyes, deeply tired, followed him without much emotion, and for a brief moment, John felt as if he might be being judged for stopping there. Trying to ignore the strange feeling, he approached the counter, keeping a polite tone as he asked how to get out of the city and towards his destination. The lady's answers were short and evasive. She spoke as if she was trying to hide something, or as if her words carried a weight he didn't understand. John noticed that she avoided looking at him directly, and whenever he asked a more specific question, she looked away, as if she was caught in some internal dilemma. When he finally asked about the road that would take him to the nearest town, the lady gave directions, but her words carried an unsettling tone. "The road always leads back. Always back," she said, as if repeating something she had said many times before. John frowned, not understanding what she meant, but assumed it was just a local expression or an old way of speaking. Without further questions, he thanked her and left, confident that he would soon be back on his way. However, as he drove along the deserted road, something unexpected began to happen. The feeling of being stuck in a cycle set in as the scenery around him did not change, and the road seemed to double back on itself. The miles passed, but he felt as if he were driving in circles, making no progress. The discomfort returned with a vengeance, as if the lady's enigmatic sentence was coming true before his eyes. The road brought him back to where he started, as if his attempt to escape had never happened. John, recognizing the same town he had just left, was in disbelief. The gas station, the old-looking houses, the trees in the background, everything was exactly as before. He stopped the car, blinking several times, trying to understand what was happening. He looked around, looking for some sign that he might have been mistaken, but everything seemed to confirm the terrible feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle. Still thinking that he might have made a mistake along the way, John decided to try again. He started the car and turned off on another road, confident that this time he would be able to find his way and escape this strange place. He drove with determination, keeping his eyes fixed on the road, alert for any change that might indicate that he was, in fact, moving forward. For miles, he drove on, feeling that he had finally left the city behind. Yet at every turn, something seemed wrong. The road, once straight, now seemed to stretch on forever, leading nowhere. John began to notice that the trees, the signs, and even the landscape around him were repeating themselves. It was as if the road was folding in on itself, like a maze that kept bringing him back to where he started no matter how many times he tried to get out. Sweat began to break out on his forehead, mixed with frustration and growing dread. When he finally realized, with horror, that he was once again back in the city center, panic set in. How was this possible? What was happening here? Looking around, he saw the same houses, the same market, the same clock standing still in the square. Everything was frozen in time, as if it had never left. The feeling that something very wrong was at play intensified, and John began to wonder if he was trapped beyond logic and reason. Now John was beginning to realize that something was deeply wrong with this place. It wasn't just a matter of disorientation or a GPS glitch. Something more sinister seemed to be at play. Every route he took, every attempt to escape, was futile. The city, in some inexplicable way, held him captive. Frustrated and growing anxious, he decided to make one last attempt to get out. He chose another road, one that seemed less obvious, full of twists and turns and dirt roads. Perhaps, he thought, a path less traveled might be his salvation. As he drove along these shortcuts, John focused on every detail, trying his best not to get lost amidst the increasingly repetitive landscape. Dirt roads, trails almost forgotten by time. He tried anything that could take him away from that strange city. However, a growing feeling of despair settled in his chest. It was as if the roads, even the most different ones, were taking him back like an invisible force, always pulling him back to the center of that place. Every mile he drove only seemed to increase his frustration. John would drive for hours, trying to ignore the suffocating feeling that he was trapped in an endless cycle. But invariably, the city would appear before him again, like a ghostly vision that refused to let him go. He would find himself back where he started, with the same silent streets, the same old buildings, and the same stop clock in the center of the square. John's mind was beginning to buckle under the pressure. No matter what he did, he was trapped. It was as if time itself was folding over him, forcing him to relive that feeling of failure over and over again. The questions echoed through his mind. How was this possible? Who or what was keeping him here? Each failed attempt eroded his sense of reality, and he felt himself slowly losing control over his own thoughts. Tired, confused, and increasingly on the verge of despair, John decided to return to the market, hoping to find the lady and try to understand what was happening. Perhaps she knew more than she had said before, or perhaps he had misinterpreted her words. With quick and nervous steps, he entered the small establishment again. But when he crossed the door, he was greeted by a silence that seemed overwhelming. The lady was no longer there. The counter was empty, and the place seemed completely abandoned, as if no one had stepped foot there for a long time. Dust covered the floor and shelves, as if days had turned into months or years. The air was heavy, still, and the smell of old, stagnant wood enveloped him. The feeling of isolation that had already plagued him grew rapidly. He walked over to the counter, running his fingers through the accumulated dust, feeling disconnected from reality. The place that had once seemed abandoned now seemed like a scene frozen in time, as if the city itself was closing in around him. John stepped out of the market and looked around, his eyes searching for any sign of life. However, the streets were completely deserted. The few people he had seen when he arrived were now gone. Not the murmur of conversation, not the distant footsteps, nothing. It was as if the entire city had been emptied, leaving him completely alone. The silence was unsettling, almost unnatural, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to come. The wind blew lightly, stirring up dust in the empty streets, but other than that, everything was still. The houses that had once seemed occupied were now closed, their windows covered by curtains that did not move. He glanced at the clock in the square, which had remained at the same time since he had arrived. Time, in this place, no longer seemed to follow its normal rules. The reality he knew was rapidly crumbling, and the feeling of being trapped in a scenario controlled by forces he did not understand grew stronger. As John walked through the empty streets, his sense of unease only grew. As he looked around, he began to notice the few residents who still roamed the city, but something about them was off. Their movements were mechanical, almost robotic. He noticed an old woman sweeping her yard, but she seemed to be making no progress. The broom moved back and forth, repeating the same motion over and over, as if she were in a rut she couldn't escape. Her eyes were glazed over, and the expression on her face betrayed no emotion. Further ahead, John saw a man sitting in a coffee shop. He was holding a cup of coffee, but he never lifted it to his mouth. He just stared straight ahead, his gaze lost, as if he were stuck in a mental loop. The scene seemed to have been paused, as if time in that city had frozen. With each passing second, John noticed more residents doing repetitive activities without any purpose or awareness. It was as if they were in a trance, condemned to relive the same moment over and over again. Intrigued and with a growing sense that something sinister was going on, John approached one of the locals. He tried to strike up a conversation with a woman walking along the sidewalk, asking about the town and how to get out of there. However, her response was vague, almost automatic, as if she wasn't really listening. "Everything here is as it always was," she said, her voice flat and expressionless. There was no life in her eyes, only an unsettling emptiness. John tried to talk to other people, but the answers he received were always the same. Short, meaningless, as if everyone was disconnected from reality. They went about their daily lives, ignoring his presence and the chaos that seemed to be taking place around them. The most disturbing thing was the feeling that they didn't even realize they were trapped in an endless cycle. The city was slowly revealing its true face. A place where time didn't flow as it should and where the residents were condemned to relive their days over and over again, never escaping. With each failed attempt at communication, John's anguish grew. He was in a place where logic and time had been distorted, and the feeling that perhaps he too was being slowly sucked into that hellish cycle began to take hold of his mind. In a small square in the center of the city, there was a large old clock. The clock was stopped, its hands showing exactly 11:11. John noticed that although everything in the city seemed to follow a cyclical pattern, the clock remained still, as if symbolizing the stagnation of the place. He approached the clock, intrigued by its stillness. The details of the clock were intricate, with symbols engraved on the base that seemed much older than the clock itself. As he examined the clock more closely, John felt something was wrong. The engraved symbols seemed to tell a story or hide a secret, something he couldn't immediately decipher. As he touched the cold metal, he felt a slight, almost imperceptible vibration. It was as if the clock was alive, waiting for something or someone to activate. A sense of urgency washed over him. The clock, somehow, seemed to hold the key to the mystery of the city. It was then that John saw something that made his heart race. The figure of the market lady stood motionless beside the ancient clock in the center of town. Her face, once marked by distrust, now seemed even more empty, as if the life had been drained from her eyes. She stared at him, but there was nothing there but a shadow of who she had once been. The clock standing behind her seemed a constant presence, as if this moment were stuck in time, reflecting the reality of this strange place. With hesitant steps, John approached, hoping she might give him some answer. But when he finally stood a few feet away from her, the lady spoke in a barely audible tone, as if the words were whispered by the wind itself. "The time here is different. You shouldn't be here. But now it's too late." Those words pierced John like knives. A chill ran down his spine, and a feeling of panic enveloped him. He tried to ask more questions, desperate to understand what she meant by too late. But before he could utter a word, the lady disappeared. There was no sound, no sudden movement. She simply dissolved into thin air, as if she had never been there, like a shadow swallowed up by the darkness around her. John looked around, his eyes darting to every corner, trying to find some sign of where she could have gone. Nothing, just the emptiness of the deserted square and the oppressive silence that seemed to suffocate him. He felt the weight of loneliness and mystery that surrounded him increase. It was as if the entire city was shrouded in a fog of impossible events, and he was now trapped in a nightmare from which he did not know how to escape. The clock remained stopped, its absence ticking a constant reminder that, here, time had stopped following natural laws. John began to realize that the clock wasn't just broken. It was the heart of the mystery. This town didn't exist in normal time. It was a place where time had stopped, and anyone who entered was trapped in an endless cycle. The clock somehow kept that cycle going, trapping everyone who entered. The stories of the townspeople made sense now. They had been here for decades, maybe even centuries, trapped in a reality where time stood still. John knew that if he didn't find a way out, he would be trapped there forever. He returned to the clock, determined to find a solution. The rusty gears, the mysterious symbols, everything indicated that the clock was more than just a decorative piece. There was something much deeper about this object. Maybe if he could somehow activate it, he could break the cycle and finally get out of this city. He began searching for any clue, anything that might indicate how to fix the clock. He searched abandoned stores, empty houses, any place that might contain something useful. Time seemed to be running out of him, even though the clock had stopped. With each passing second, John felt like he was closer to being lost forever in this place. The city, once silent, now seemed to have a presence. He didn't know how to explain it, but it was as if something was watching his every move. After hours of searching, John found an old toolbox in an antique shop. He knew that if the clock had any chance of working again, he would need these tools to work its gears. He returned to the square, determined to solve the mystery. The clock seemed almost to mock him, with its still hands and imposing presence. With his tools in hand, John set to work. As John fiddled with the gears of the clock, a strange sensation came over him. The air around him seemed to grow thicker, almost suffocating, as if the city itself was waiting for his next move with silent anticipation. The feeling was palpable, as if everything around him had stopped to watch him, waiting for the outcome of this mysterious task. He knew he was onto something big, but the uncertainty of what it really meant weighed heavily on him. Each gear he adjusted seemed to emit a faint metallic sound that reverberated in the silence of the square, amplifying his apprehension. Time there no longer followed its normal rules, and fiddling with the clockwork seemed like playing with something he barely understood. John knew that he might be dealing with forces beyond his comprehension, but he was driven as much by the search for a solution as by the growing desperation to escape this temporal trap. As he walked forward, a dark thought struck him. What would really happen if he managed to fix the clock? Would this be the end of his imprisonment, or the beginning of something much worse? The idea of freeing the city was appealing, but a constant doubt lingered in his mind. What if, by fixing the clock, he was condemning himself to an even more terrible fate? It was as if every move he made could change the course of not only his own history, but that of everything and everyone around him. Still, he couldn't stop. Each adjustment was made with a mixture of caution and desperation, his fingers trembling slightly as he continued to turn the gears. The sound of grinding metal seemed to echo in his ears, and the weight of responsibility he carried grew with every passing second. The watch was more than just a mechanical object. It was a key, a gateway to something he didn't yet fully understand. And with every passing second, John felt himself getting closer to revelation, or his own destruction. Finally, after what seemed like endless hours, John managed to turn one of the main gears. The sound the clock made was loud, metallic and deep, echoing across the empty square. The hands, which had previously been motionless, began to move slowly, as if time were awakening from a long sleep. John looked at the clock, his heart beating in an irregular rhythm. The feeling that something monumental was happening took hold of him. Time, which had seemed to stand still, was now flowing again. For a brief moment, he felt a mixture of relief and triumph, believing that somehow he was on the right path to escape from this place. However, this feeling was quickly replaced by a wave of dread. That was when he noticed a presence behind him. He didn't need to turn around immediately to know that he was no longer alone. A shadow, dense and menacing, projected itself on the ground in front of him, long and distorted, growing larger by the second. The city, once silent and static, now seemed to vibrate around him. It was as if, by fixing the clock, he had given life to something much larger, something that had been dormant and waiting for this exact moment. The air around him seemed to tremble. The buildings in the distance emanated a slight distortion, as if reality itself were breaking apart and rearranging itself. John felt the presence approaching, and fear overcame him. Unsure of what to expect, he turned slowly. The shadow forming behind him seemed more alive than anything else in the place. It was as if the city, which had previously been dead in time, was now gaining a new and frightening awareness. The presence, dark and indefinable, was watching him. The clock continued to tick away the seconds, each tick resounding like a warning, a countdown to something he was not ready to face. John turned slowly, knowing there was something, or someone there. The entire city seemed to be watching him, waiting for what would come next. The clock was working now, but John wasn't sure if that was a good thing. The shadow grew closer, and reality around him began to distort. He realized that by fixing the clock, he had awakened something ancient and powerful, something that didn't want to be released. Staring into the shadow, John realized that his battle was far from over. The clock, the city, the people, they were all part of a mystery far greater than he had ever imagined. And now, he was caught in a race against time, a fight that could decide the fate of not only the city, but his own as well. Did this story get you hooked? What do you think happened to John? Leave your comments below with your theories. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that defy the limits of reality.